Everyone in the city knew about the billionaire's wife. She was the kind of woman who made people stop and stare when she entered a room, not only because of her beauty, but because of the heavy air she carried with her. Servants trembled in her presence, and workers whispered stories about her sharp tongue and impossible demands. No one wanted to work for her, but the promise of high pay kept new faces coming through the gates of her massive mansion. The strange thing was that no one ever lasted. Some left in tears, others stormed out in anger, and many were dismissed without warning. It was almost like a curse. Whoever worked close to her was destined to fail. The mansion itself looked like a dream from the outside, with tall iron gates, shining glass windows, and gardens that stretched further than the eye could see. People often said it looked like a palace, but inside it felt more like a battlefield. Employees came in with excitement, believing the job would change their lives, only to walk away weeks later, broken and humiliated. The city began calling it the impossible job. It wasn't that she beat or physically harmed anyone. Her weapon was her words, her looks, her endless criticism that cut sharper than a knife. If someone polished the table until it shone, she would find a single speck of dust and call them lazy. If the chef cooked the finest meal, she would push the plate away and say it tasted cheap. If a bodyguard stood silently at the door, she would snap that his breathing was too loud. Nothing was ever right, and because she was the billionaire's wife, she knew she could dismiss anyone with a single wave of her hand. Stories of her temper spread far beyond the mansion walls. People in the city joked that working for her was like walking barefoot on glass. Even those desperate for money thought twice before applying. Yet the salary was unmatched, and for some, the temptation was too strong. They told themselves, "I'll be the one who makes it." But one by one, they failed. The record was 3 months, and even that man left with shaking hands, refusing to speak about what had happened inside. Then came David. He wasn't like the others who tried before him. He didn't come from wealth, and he didn't wear arrogance on his shoulders. He was a tall black man with steady eyes, the kind of eyes that had seen struggle and refused to break easily. His walk was calm, his face quiet, and when people asked why he was applying, he only said, "Work is work. Let's see how it goes." The staff at the mansion laughed when they heard about his hiring. They whispered in the kitchen, "He won't last a week." Some even started betting on the exact day he would be dismissed. The gardeners chuckled, saying they had seen it too many times before. The cooks shook their heads, knowing the pattern by heart. When David first arrived, the atmosphere around him felt heavy, as if the very walls of the mansion were waiting to swallow him. The wife stood at the top of the marble staircase, dressed in a flowing silk gown, her sharp eyes fixed on him. Most employees would have lowered their gaze, too afraid to meet her stare. But David didn't flinch. He greeted her with a calm nod, respectful yet not bending too low. He didn't tremble, didn't force a smile, and didn't try to impress. He simply stood like a man who knew who he was. That very first moment set him apart. The wife tilted her head slightly, narrowing her eyes as if trying to figure out what made him different. She gave him tasks immediately, not small ones to test his hands, but endless instructions designed to break him before he even settled in. "Take this list and make sure it's done in exactly 1 hour," she said, handing him a page filled with impossible details. Others before him would panic, rush, and fail. David looked at the list, nodded once, and set off without a word. Hours later, everything was done, not rushed, not sloppy, but with precision. The wife inspected each task, trying to find mistakes. She found none. For the first time in years, she didn't have an insult ready. She dismissed him coldly, but deep inside, she had noticed something unusual. Still, the staff below stairs refused to believe. "It's just the first day," they whispered. "Wait until tomorrow. He'll be gone like the rest." Yet something in David's calmness left them uneasy. He wasn't a man who cracked easily. He wasn't a man who sought approval with trembling hands, and that made them wonder if the impossible job had finally found its match. The city had heard this story many times before, new workers coming in and leaving broken. But this time, something felt different. The revolving door had stopped spinning for a moment, and all eyes turned to the new employee, waiting to see how long he would last. For now, the mansion that had swallowed so many before him had met someone who didn't seem afraid of its shadows. And that was how David's story began, with whispers, doubt, and a silent strength no one yet understood. When David walked into the mansion on his second day, the air already felt heavy with expectation. The staff watched him closely, some smirking, some shaking their heads, waiting for him to stumble. They had seen this story so many times. At first, new employees would smile with confidence, but it would not take long before the wife broke them. David, however, did not look nervous. His steps were calm, his face steady, his hands relaxed. He didn't seem like a man preparing for battle, but like someone who knew battles were part of life. The wife was sitting in the grand hall when he arrived. She was surrounded by flowers, jewels, and luxury, yet her eyes were sharp, as though nothing in this world could satisfy her. She looked at him with a slow, measuring stare. She had broken people with that gaze alone. Some froze, some stuttered, some bowed too deeply in an attempt to please her. David simply bowed his head slightly, not too low, not too high, and greeted her politely. There was no fear in his tone, no rush to impress. That small act unsettled her. She had expected him to be like all the rest. From the very beginning, she tested him. She asked for the tea she liked, but gave no instructions about how she wanted it prepared. Most workers would panic, rushing to the kitchen and bothering the cooks with endless questions. David, instead, watched her carefully, noticing the untouched cups from the day before. He studied the smell, the leaves used, the little spoon of honey left on the tray. When he brought the tea, she lifted the cup to her lips, her face blank. The staff in the hallway held their breath, waiting for her to explode. She took a sip, lowered the cup slowly, and said nothing. Silence. That silence was louder than a shout. For the first time in weeks, she had nothing to complain about. But she wasn't going to let it end there. She gave him more instructions, piling them on top of each other. Take my dress to the cleaners, but make sure they use silk-friendly wash. Bring the jewelry box from upstairs, the one in the blue case, not the red. Order a new set of imported roses, but make sure they arrive before sunset, and do not, under any condition, be late for the luncheon schedule. Her words came fast, her tone sharp, as if each order was a weapon aimed to break his calm. Most people would have scribbled notes, confused and nervous. David listened quietly, nodded once, and left to complete the tasks. The mansion was large and confusing, with hallways that twisted like a maze. It was easy for new workers to get lost. The wife knew this, and often used it as a trap. She waited, expecting him to stumble in late, lost or sweating with panic. But David had the eyes of a man who studied before he acted. The day before, he had memorized the paths while moving through the house. He returned at the exact time she demanded, every task finished. The dress was at the cleaners, the right jewelry box was placed in front of her, the roses were already being carried in, and the luncheon schedule was in order. She raised her eyebrows slightly, a flicker of surprise breaking through her cold face. It was the smallest sign, but the staff who watched from a distance noticed it immediately. This woman, who always found fault, was silent again. She scanned the jewelry box, glanced at the roses, checked the clock on the wall, but there was no mistake to point at. She had prepared to humiliate him, yet he gave her nothing to use. Instead of praising him, she waved her hand with a cold gesture, dismissing him as though it was nothing. But deep inside, she had begun to notice the difference. By evening, the whispers in the kitchen grew louder. "He is strange," one of the maids said. "He doesn't rush, he doesn't fear, but he doesn't argue either." The cook shook his head. "It won't last. She'll find something to break him soon." The gardener chuckled and said, "I'll give him 2 more days." Still, when David walked past them carrying himself with quiet dignity, a small doubt lingered in their voices. They wanted to believe he would fail, but something about him didn't fit the old pattern. Later that night, the wife decided to try again. She called for him when the house was quiet, long after most workers had gone to bed. When he appeared at the door, she handed him a book and said, "Read this to me." It was not a simple request. She had done this before with others, choosing books in foreign languages or with complicated phrases, just to laugh at their mistakes. David took the book, opened it calmly, and began reading. His voice was smooth, steady, and without hesitation. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't clumsy either. His tone carried patience, almost like he was reading not to impress her, but because the words deserved respect. She listened for longer than she planned, her eyes resting on him as if she were searching for a crack in his mask. But the mask wasn't there. What she saw was something real, someone who didn't pretend, didn't flatter, didn't shrink. When he finished, she dismissed him without a word, but after he left, she stayed awake for hours, staring at the book in her lap. The impossible job had claimed so many victims before. Yet somehow, in only 2 days, David had managed to do something no one else did. He hadn't pleased her exactly, but he hadn't failed either. He had stood his ground with respect, carried out every order without fear, and given her silence instead of excuses. The staff downstairs still whispered, still doubted, but some of them, in secret, began to wonder, could this be the one who would finally last? The mansion from the outside looked like a dream. Shining glass windows reflected the sun, and the gardens were filled with roses and fountains. People passing by thought it was a place of happiness, a symbol of power and wealth. But David, after only a few days inside, saw a very different truth. Behind the beautiful walls, the air was heavy, almost suffocating. The staff moved like shadows, speaking only in whispers, afraid to make even the smallest mistake. Everyone seemed to live in fear of the wife's voice. She ruled the house like a queen with an iron crown. Her orders echoed in the hallways, sharp and cold. If a vase was placed slightly out of line, she would shout. If the food was even a little warm instead of hot, she would throw it away and insult the cook. The gardeners trimmed the hedges while trembling, knowing that if even one leaf looked wrong, she would scold them for hours. It was as if nothing, no matter how perfect, could satisfy her. The strange part was that the husband, the billionaire, was rarely around. He was always traveling for business, leaving his wife to control the mansion alone. That gave her even more power, and she used it without hesitation. To most people, she was impossible. To David, however, she was not just anger and pride. He noticed things others ignored. There were moments when she thought no one was watching. In those moments, the mask of power slipped. David saw her sitting by the large window in silence, staring at the gardens with an expression that looked more like loneliness than anger. He saw her at dinner sometimes, pushing food around her plate without eating, her face empty when no one dared to look at her. He noticed the long pauses between her sharp words, as if she wanted to say something else, but didn't know how. While the other workers feared her voice, David paid attention to her silence. He realized the anger was only a shield, a way to keep people away. She lived in a palace full of people, yet she was deeply alone. The servants avoided her out of fear, the husband was never home, and friends only came for parties and gossip. When the lights went off and the halls grew quiet, she was just another woman sitting in a giant house that felt empty. One evening, when she returned from a gathering, she entered the house with her usual sharpness. She threw her coat at David and snapped, "Don't wrinkle it." He caught it quickly and hung it neatly. But as she walked away, he noticed her eyes were red, as if she had been crying in the car. She didn't speak of it, and no one dared to ask. The staff whispered that she was cruel, but David began to see another truth. She was a woman carrying a pain no one else cared about. The staff continued their bets in the kitchen. He's lasted longer than most," one maid whispered, "but she'll break him soon. Wait until she explodes again." They were right about the explosion. The wife tested him every day. She accused him of being late when he wasn't. She told him he was clumsy when he wasn't. She even ordered him to bring items she didn't actually want, just to see how he would react. Most men before him would argue, defend themselves, or beg for another chance. David didn't. He listened, nodded, and stayed calm. He didn't fight her anger with more anger, and he didn't try to melt it with flattery. He stood in a middle ground, steady like a rock in the storm. One afternoon, she called for him while the rest of the house was quiet. "Why are you still here?" she asked suddenly. Her voice wasn't sharp this time, just curious. David looked at her calmly and replied, "I was hired to work, ma'am. So I work." That simple answer unsettled her more than any apology or excuse. For a brief second, her lips trembled as if she wanted to respond, but she turned away and waved him out. Over time, her anger became less sharp when directed at him. She still barked orders, still tested him, but there was a hesitation now, as though part of her wanted to see how far his patience could go. Sometimes she gave him impossible schedules, only to find he managed them without complaint. Sometimes she insulted his efforts, yet he still returned the next day with the same calm expression. It was not weakness that kept him there, it was strength. He treated her not as a monster, but as a person. While others looked at her with fear or hatred, he looked at her with steady eyes that neither judged nor begged. And that slowly began to change the air between them. The staff noticed small differences too. The wife's shouting in the halls grew less frequent. Her orders were still strict, but her rage did not last as long. Once she even said, "Good," after David completed a task. It was a small word, almost whispered, but for the staff it was shocking. Some thought David had bewitched her. Others joked that he must have secret powers. No one believed it was simply his patience and quiet strength. The mansion was still a storm, but now it had one anchor. Behind the walls that looked perfect to the outside world, there was chaos, yes, but also the beginning of something no one expected. For the first time in years, the wife had found someone she could not scare away. And though she would never admit it, her silence began to carry something new whenever she looked at David. Not just loneliness, but a strange curiosity. She wanted to know why this man was different and why, against all odds, he had not yet run from the impossible job. It was only a matter of time before the first big clash came. The billionaire's wife had a habit of creating storms out of nothing, and this time she chose David as the target. One late afternoon, she was preparing for a dinner event. Her dressing room was filled with gowns, silk fabrics spread across the bed, and jewelry boxes shining under the golden lights. She called David inside and told him to bring her favorite blue dress. He picked the one she had pointed to earlier that week and laid it out carefully. But when she looked at it, her eyes narrowed sharply. "This is not the dress I asked for," she snapped, her voice echoing through the hall. The maids outside flinched, already whispering that this was the end. No one had ever survived her rage when she accused them of failing her. Most workers would collapse with apologies, begging for forgiveness even if they were right. That was the safest way to escape her anger, but David did not panic. He looked at the dress, then back at her, and spoke with the same calm tone he always carried. "This is the dress you showed me, ma'am. If it is not the one you want, I will bring another." His words were steady, neither challenging nor submissive. It was not defiance, but it was not weakness either. The wife froze for a second. She had expected him to crumble, to stutter, to throw himself at her feet in apology. Instead, he stood straight, his eyes respectful but unafraid. That balance, firm but calm, was something she had never seen before. For the first time in a long while, she didn't know how to respond. Her anger rose in her throat, but no words came out. After a moment of silence, she waved her hand sharply. "Leave it. Get out." The staff watching from the corners of the room were stunned. They whispered among themselves later in the kitchen. "Did you see that? She didn't fire him. She didn't even scream after that." One of the cooks shook his head in disbelief. Any other man would have been out the door before sunset. How is he still here? But the truth was simple. David had not given her the reaction she craved. Her anger was a weapon, and it usually worked because people gave her the power she wanted. They cried, they begged, they surrendered. But David gave her no such satisfaction. He stood like a wall, not mocking her, not bowing too low, but just holding his ground. And that unsettled her more than anything else. Later that night, when she sat alone in her private room, she thought about the moment again. His words replayed in her mind. "This is the dress you showed me, ma'am. If it is not the one you want, I will bring another." There had been no fear in his voice, no trembling in his hands. He had spoken to her as if she were a normal person, not a queen who could crush him with one order. That simple fact bothered her, and at the same time, it intrigued her. The next day, she tried again. She gave him a list of instructions that contradicted each other, impossible to complete without failing one part. She wanted to see him struggle, to see cracks in his calm. But when he returned with everything handled in a balanced way, she was forced once again into silence. He explained each step with simple clarity, showing her that while her instructions conflicted, he had found the best solution without disobeying. She dismissed him coldly, but her mind was restless. Why was he so different? Why didn't he break like the others? The staff grew even more curious. The maids whispered that maybe the wife secretly liked him. The guards joked that he must have nerves made of steel. The gardeners said it was only a matter of time before she pushed harder. Yet deep inside, some began to respect him. He was the only one who dared to stand tall in front of her and still kept his job. One evening, she summoned him again. This time, her tone was softer, though she tried to hide it. She pointed to a box of letters and said, "Take these away." David nodded and picked them up. As he left, her eyes followed him. For a moment, she wondered if he had noticed the slight tremble in her voice. She quickly straightened herself, forcing her mask of coldness back in place. David, however, had noticed. He always noticed the things others ignored. He knew she was testing him, but he also knew there was something deeper behind her sharp words. The clash over the dress had not only been a test of his patience, but also a crack in her armor. He had stood firm, and in doing so, he had shown her something she had not felt in years: resistance without cruelty, respect without fear. The mansion was still a dangerous place for any employee, but David had changed the game. Where others had fallen, he had held his ground. The wife could not admit it, but she respected him in her own hidden way. That respect came wrapped in silence, in the lack of dismissal, in the fact that he still walked the halls while others had long been sent away. The clash that should have ended his time at the mansion instead became the moment that set him apart. For the first time in years, the billionaire's wife had found someone who did not collapse under her fire. And though she pretended not to care, deep inside she could not stop thinking about the man who refused to bow or break. Days turned into weeks, and something unusual began to happen in the mansion. For the first time in years, an employee had lasted more than a month under the billionaire's wife. The staff, who once whispered that David would be gone in days, now spoke in hushed disbelief. "He's still here," one maid murmured. "She hasn't fired him yet." The cook shook his head. "It's impossible. She must be planning something." But deep down, even they knew things were changing. The wife herself began to notice small details about David. He remembered things without being told twice. When she asked for her tea, it was ready exactly the way she liked. Not too sweet, not too strong. When she needed a scarf, he placed it in her hand before she even asked, because he had already seen the wind outside. When her schedule was full of appointments, he reminded her gently and always made sure she was never late. These were little things, but they added up. What surprised her most was that he never tried to please her in an obvious way. Others before him had showered her with compliments, thinking flattery would save their jobs. She despised that. David didn't flatter. He simply did his work with quiet precision, like someone who respected himself as much as he respected her. That balance was new to her. One evening, after hosting a long dinner party for the city's elites, she returned to the mansion exhausted. Usually, she would snap at the staff, blaming them for her bad mood, and send them running in fear. That night, she dropped her heavy jewelry box on the table and sighed. David walked forward, steady as always, and offered her a glass of water. She took it without thinking, sipped slowly, and for the first time whispered something she had never said to an employee before. "Thank you." The words were quiet, almost lost in the silence of the room, but the maids nearby heard them, and their eyes widened. They whispered later in the kitchen like it was a miracle. "Did you hear her? She said thank you." The gardener laughed nervously. "You're lying." But the cook swore it was true. The story spread through the mansion like fire. A single word, "thank you," was enough to shock everyone because it had been years since anyone had heard her say it. David didn't react with surprise. He simply nodded and continued his work as if nothing unusual had happened. But inside, he knew that small word carried weight. It was a crack in the wall she had built around herself. In the days that followed, more changes appeared. When she gave him instructions, her tone was still firm, but less cutting. She no longer shouted as much when he was involved. Sometimes when she walked past him, her eyes lingered for a second longer, as if she was studying him, trying to understand why he was different. The staff, meanwhile, could not stop gossiping. Some said he had charmed her. Others claimed he was too stubborn for even her to break. A few whispered that maybe she liked him in ways she shouldn't. The mansion buzzed with rumors, but no one dared speak them too loudly. One day, she tested him in another way. She purposely left a list of tasks on the table, more than any one person could handle in the time given. It was her old habit of pushing until people broke. When she checked later, she expected excuses, failure, or at least panic. Instead, David presented everything done, each task carefully finished. He explained in a calm voice how he had arranged his time, prioritizing the important things first, making sure nothing was missed. She listened in silence, her lips pressed together. At the end, instead of scolding him, she only nodded slightly. That small gesture was her way of admitting she was impressed. By now, she had begun to notice that her house no longer felt quite the same. For years, the mansion had been filled with fear, with staff rushing about like prisoners in chains. But David's steady presence began to spread. His calmness made others calmer. His patience gave others courage. When he was nearby, even the wife's anger seemed less sharp. One night, after a storm outside had shaken the mansion windows, David found her sitting alone in the library. Books surrounded her, but her face looked tired and lonely. She looked up at him, as if expecting him to leave her in peace. But he simply stood there, quiet and respectful, waiting to see if she needed anything. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she asked softly, "Why don't you ever look afraid of me?" His answer was simple. "Because I don't see you as a monster, ma'am. I see you as a person." She stared at him, stunned. No one had ever said such words to her. People treated her either with fear or with fake admiration, but never with honesty. She dismissed him quickly, pretending his answer meant nothing. Yet when he left the room, her chest felt heavy, her heart beating faster than before. The wife who once mocked and insulted every worker was now facing a truth she couldn't ignore. This man was not like the rest. He had patience where others had fear, quiet strength where others had weakness. Slowly, without realizing it, she was beginning to change too. The mansion staff noticed more smiles, more silences instead of screams, and once even a soft laugh echoing from her room when David spoke. For them, it was unbelievable. For her, it was confusing. And for David, it was simply the result of her as she had never been treated before, with respect that was real, not forced. The impossible job that no one could survive was starting to look different, and all because one man had chosen to stand, not with fear, not with flattery, but with dignity. One night, when the rest of the mansion was quiet, David passed by the long corridor near the wife's private rooms. He was about to leave for his own quarters when he heard something strange, a faint, muffled sound, almost like crying. At first, he thought it might be the wind pushing through the tall windows, but when he stopped to listen carefully, he realized it was coming from behind her door. It was the sound of someone sobbing softly, trying to hide it. David froze for a moment. No one in the mansion could imagine the powerful, cold wife crying. To the world, she was untouchable, too strong to show weakness. But here she was, alone in the night, breaking down where no one could see. Most workers would have walked away, pretending they heard nothing, too afraid to disturb her. David stood there for a long second, unsure. Finally, he lifted his hand and knocked lightly. There was silence, the sobs immediately stopping. He spoke gently, his voice low. "Do you need water, ma'am?" No reply came. For a moment he thought he had made a mistake. But then he heard her footsteps, quick and sharp, moving away from the door. She did not answer him, but the next morning, something about her voice was different. When she spoke, it was still firm but softer than usual, like she was holding back something. That small moment stayed with David. He understood that behind her anger was a deeper pain. She lived in a world of gossip and judgment. To outsiders, she was only the billionaire's wife, a title that looked glamorous but felt like a cage. She had wealth, beauty, and power, but not freedom, not love, not peace. Even her husband, the billionaire, barely spent time with her. He treated her like another trophy, a jewel to show off at parties. And when he was gone, she was left in silence, surrounded by walls too big for her loneliness. Over time, she began to open small pieces of herself to David. It wasn't in big conversations, but in passing remarks, half-whispered confessions she quickly disguised as casual words. One afternoon, she asked, "Do you know what it's like to walk into a room and have everyone talk about you, but no one talk to you?" David listened quietly, not interrupting, and she moved on before he could answer. Another evening, she muttered, "People think Having everything means being happy. They don't understand." Then she stopped, as if she had said too much, and dismissed him quickly. The staff noticed these changes too. They were shocked that she spoke more words to David than to anyone else. They wondered what he had done to deserve such treatment. But David knew the truth. It wasn't what he did, it was what he didn't do. He didn't try to solve her pain with empty comfort. He didn't treat her like a fragile glass, nor did he fear her like a monster. He just listened with patience and honesty. One day, when the mansion was hosting another grand party, David watched her closely. She laughed with guests, her smile wide and perfect, her dress shining like it was made of light. But when she turned away, her eyes went flat and empty, as though all her joy was painted on her face like a mask. Later that night, after the guests left and the lights dimmed, she sat alone in the great hall. David approached quietly and asked if she wanted anything. She looked at him for a long time, her lips pressed together, and then said, "Do you ever feel like you're performing for the world?" He simply replied, "Sometimes." She didn't ask further, but that short answer made her eyes soften for just a moment. Her confessions grew slowly, piece by piece. She revealed that her marriage was not what people believed. The billionaire cared more about business than about her. She had been left behind in a palace of riches, but without warmth. She said people only approached her because of her husband's power, never because they wanted to know her. When she looked at David, she saw something different. He didn't come with greed in his eyes, nor fear in his hands. He treated her like a human being. That was something she hadn't felt in years. Sometimes, when she spoke too much, she would suddenly cover it with anger. If she revealed a memory or a sadness, she would quickly change her tone and snap an order at him, trying to hide her weakness. But David never reacted with surprise. He followed the order calmly, as if nothing had changed. His silence gave her space to feel safe. She began to realize that he was not there to judge, not there to gossip, not there to take advantage. He was simply there, steady and reliable. This new bond was not love, not yet, but it was something powerful. It was trust. She trusted him enough to let her mask slip when no one else was watching. He was the first person in years who had seen her cry, even if she never admitted it out loud. The staff downstairs noticed her softer moods. They whispered that she had changed since David arrived. "She doesn't shout like before," one maid said. "She seems calmer." Another added, "I saw her smile yesterday, just a little." The cooks and guards didn't believe it at first, but as days passed, they too saw the truth. Something was happening between the wife and the quiet employee who refused to be broken. Her pain, once hidden deep inside, was now finding small cracks to escape through, and David was the one who noticed it. He didn't try to fix her. He didn't try to rescue her. Instead, he gave her the one thing she never received from anyone else: patience and understanding. And slowly, those hidden tears she shed at night began to turn into words she dared to share in the daylight. The woman who once ruled her house with cruelty and fire was beginning to reveal her humanity, and all because one man chose not to run away from the storm, but to stand quietly in it, waiting for her to let him see the truth. Rumors began to spread beyond the mansion walls. The city, always hungry for gossip, started asking questions. "Why hasn't she fired him yet?" people whispered. "No one survives that woman." Some believed David was bribing her. Others said he had found a way to charm her with tricks. A few even claimed he had some hidden magic. But the truth was far simpler. He gave her what no one else ever had: respect without fear, kindness without weakness. Inside the mansion, the staff grew restless with curiosity. The maids noticed that she raised her voice less when David was around. The cooks saw that she didn't throw away meals when he managed the kitchen schedule. Even the guards who once smirked at him began to watch him with a quiet kind of respect. They didn't understand how he was doing it, but they couldn't deny what they saw. He was changing the air inside the mansion. The billionaire himself, however, was not blind. One evening, after a long trip, he returned home unexpectedly. He entered the dining hall where his wife sat in her usual cold silence. David was there too, arranging the evening details with calm efficiency. The billionaire glanced at him and then laughed mockingly. "So this is the one you still haven't managed to drive away?" His voice was loud enough for the staff to hear. "What's so special about him? Did you run out of people to fire?" The wife's eyes flashed. For years, she had let her husband's mocking words pass without defense. He often belittled her in front of others, treating her like an accessory to his wealth. But this time something changed. She looked at David, standing quietly, not responding to the insult, and something stirred inside her. She turned to her husband and said sharply, "He is good at what he does, better than anyone else you've seen in this house." The room froze. The staff who heard it nearly dropped their trays. The billionaire himself raised his eyebrows, surprised. Never before had she defended an employee, not once in all her years. Yet here she was, standing up for the one man who refused to break under her tests. The billionaire laughed again, but there was unease in his voice now. "Better be careful, dear. Don't let the help climb too high in your eyes." He left the hall, muttering to himself, but the damage was done. The staff whispered furiously that night in the kitchen. "Did you hear? She defended him. She actually defended him." Some thought it was a sign she was losing her sharpness. Others believed it meant she was finally changing. For David, nothing seemed different on the surface. He continued his work with the same patience and calmness as before. But deep inside, he knew the moment was important. The wife had chosen, in front of her husband and her staff, to speak on his behalf. That single act meant more than words could describe. In the days that followed, her attitude toward David shifted even further. She began to ask his opinion on small things: what flowers should decorate the dining table, which route was best for travel, whether a guest list seemed too long. They were small questions, but for her, they were a huge step. For years, she had trusted no one, asked nothing from anyone. Now she was letting David's voice enter her decisions. The staff noticed too. They no longer saw her as the untouchable queen, but as a woman who occasionally lowered her guard when he was nearby. Once, when David handed her a folder she had misplaced, she smiled faintly before catching herself and straightening her face again. That fleeting smile, seen by two maids, became the hottest topic downstairs. "She smiled at him!" they gasped. "I swear, she smiled." At night, when the mansion grew quiet, she sometimes lingered near where David worked, pretending to look over papers or books. In truth, she was simply testing the feeling of his presence. His calm steadiness gave her something she hadn't felt in years: safety. She had been surrounded by wealth and guards, but none of it ever gave her the peace she found when he was near. The city's gossip circles, meanwhile, twisted the story into wild shapes. Some said the wife had fallen in love with the new employee. Others said he had discovered a secret about her and was using it to stay in the mansion. No one knew the truth, that it wasn't love or blackmail, but trust. Trust so rare it looked unbelievable to those outside. One evening, as the staff cleared the dining room, she stopped David before he left. Her voice was lower than usual, almost gentle. "Do you know why they all failed before you?" she asked. David looked at her calmly and replied, "Maybe because they saw your anger but not your loneliness." She froze at his words, her chest tightening. No one had ever spoken so directly to her. For a moment, her eyes glistened, but she quickly turned away and said, "Go, that will be all." But as David walked out, she sat in her chair, trembling. His words had cut straight through her walls. He had seen the truth she spent years hiding. It frightened her, but it also made her feel something she had almost forgotten existed: hope. The impossible job had turned into something no one could have predicted. The wife who once tore through workers like paper now found herself defending one man, listening to him, even trusting him. And though she would never admit it aloud, her heart had already decided this was no ordinary employee. This was the man who had done what everyone else thought was impossible. He had reached her. Months passed, and the impossible had already happened. David was still there. The mansion, once known as a place of fear and quick dismissals, now felt different. The wife, who had chased away countless employees with her anger and impossible demands, had found someone she could not break. What no one expected was that she herself had changed in the process. The woman who once barked orders with venom now spoke with measured words. She still held her authority, still demanded perfection, but the cruelty in her tone had softened. The staff noticed. They no longer ran like terrified shadows through the halls. They worked with more ease, more confidence, because they saw that her rage no longer burned as hot. Some even dared to say that the mansion felt lighter now, less like a cage and more like a home. David had not only survived her tests, he had transformed her without trying. His calmness had become like a mirror, reflecting back her storms until she grew tired of fighting herself. His respect, steady and honest, made her feel human again, something she had forgotten she was beneath the layers of wealth and reputation. And for the first time in years, she trusted someone. The city outside could not believe it. Gossip spread through dinner parties and high-class gatherings. "Have you heard?" they whispered. The billionaire's wife finally kept an employee. Some said he was clever, and others claimed he was lucky, but the truth was something much deeper. He had stayed when no one else would, and by staying, he had given her something money could not buy: loyalty without fear. One evening, she stood on the balcony, staring out at the city lights. David was nearby, as he always was, quiet but present. After a long silence, she said softly, "They all thought I was impossible." Her voice trembled slightly. Maybe they were right. David turned to her, his expression steady. "No, ma'am, you only needed someone who wouldn't run." Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. She simply looked at him, and for the first time, her eyes carried no mask. In that moment, she wasn't the billionaire's wife or the queen of a cold mansion. She was just a woman who had been alone too long, finally seen by someone who did not judge her. The staff downstairs continued their whispers, but now with awe instead of mockery. "He did it," they said. "He lasted. He changed her." They could hardly believe it themselves. Some even felt grateful, because their own lives in the mansion had become easier thanks to him. Where once the halls were filled with constant shouting, now they heard footsteps, quiet conversations, and sometimes even laughter. The billionaire himself remained distant, wrapped up in his business. He hardly noticed the transformation happening under his own roof. But the staff noticed, the city noticed, and above all, the wife noticed. She began to carry herself differently, with less bitterness in her eyes. And though she still commanded respect, there was a new layer beneath her voice, something softer, something almost warm. The greatest change within her heart. For years, she had believed no one could ever stay beside her. People came for money, for status, or simply because they had no choice, but all of them eventually left, broken or bitter. David was the only one who had remained, not because he had to, but because he chose to. He had faced her worst storms and still stood strong, and that gave her something she thought she would never feel again: faith in another person. As the months rolled on, the mansion became known for something new. People no longer spoke only of the wife's cruelty, but of the mysterious employee who had lasted where no one else could. No employee ever survived her, they said, shaking their heads in wonder. Until him. It became a legend of its own, whispered in markets, in parties, in the kitchens of other mansions. Inside, she sometimes found herself watching David quietly, wondering how he did it. How had he managed to reach her when no one else had? How had he seen the loneliness behind her anger? She never asked because she feared the answer. But in her heart, she knew the truth. It was not tricks or magic. It was simply his humanity. One night, after a long day, she dismissed the other staff early. Only David remained, as always, ensuring everything was in order. She looked at him and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "You've done the impossible." He bowed his head slightly, but before he could speak, she added, "Don't ever leave." Her eyes glistened, betraying the emotions she usually hid. David did not answer with promises or flowery words. He only said, "I'll stay as long as you need me." It was simple, but it carried more weight than anything she had heard in years. And so the story that once began with fear ended with something no one believed possible. The wife who had driven away countless employees now had someone who stood by her side, unbroken and unwavering. She had changed, her mansion had changed, and even her reputation began to change. The city continued to talk, the staff continued to whisper, but within the grand mansion, a quiet truth remained. No one had ever lasted with the billionaire's wife, until one black employee did the impossible.